Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Scriptura. In this video, we'll walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 44. These are issues that anyone doing serious study of this psalm is going to have to deal with, and each of these 3 issues impacts how you understand the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 17, the top 3 issues are the line division of verses 2 to 3, the text and meaning of verse 5, and the identity of the speaker in verses 5, 7, and 16. The first of our top exegetical issues in Psalm 44 is the line division of verses 2 to 3 in the Hebrew, or verses 1 to 2 in the English. In the Masoretic text, the words Ata Yadcha are placed at the beginning of the Hebrew verse 3. Most modern versions follow this reading, as we can see in the ESV. O God, we have heard with our ears, our fathers have told us, what deeds you performed in their days, in the days of old. You with your own hand drove out the nations, but them you planted. You afflicted the peoples, but them you set free. Some translations, however, read Ata Yadcha as if it belongs syntactically with the previous clause at the end of verse 2, as in the REB. We have heard for ourselves, God. Our forefathers have told us what deeds you did in their time, all your hand accomplished in days of old. To plant them in the land, you drove out the nations. To settle them, you laid waste the inhabitants. BHS recommends reading Ata Yadcha with the preceding clause in verse 2, as well as amending Yadcha to V'yadcha, in order to make an instrumental meaning more clear. Fockelman argues that this alternative line division would significantly improve the poetic balance of the lines. The MT divides the lines as in the table here. According to Fockelman, if we reconstruct the historical syllable count rather than following the Tiberian vocalization tradition, the parallel lines seem rather unbalanced, namely 7 and 3 for verse 2 C and D, and 14 and 10 for verse 3 A and B. If we divide the lines with Fockelman, however, then the lines are much more balanced, namely 7 and 8 syllables for verse 2 C and D, and 9 and 10 syllables for verse 3A and B. Admittedly, the lines seem considerably more balanced under this proposal. However, syllable counting is not the only way of measuring line balance. If instead we count prosodic words, the imbalance does not seem quite as problematic. Verse 2 C and D has 3 and 2 words, while verse 3A and B has 5 and 3 words. This is still not perfectly balanced, but also not necessarily problematic. Thus, poetic line length is not a sufficient reason to join Ata Yadcha with verse 2. A major argument against joining Ata Yadcha to verse 2 would be the resulting word order. According to the Biblical Hebrew Reference Grammar, unmarked post-verbal word order places the subject and other adjuncts before temporal adjuncts. But if Ata Yadcha is read with verse 2, then we would have 2 temporal adjuncts before the subject and instrument. This word order is inexplicable in terms of information structure, and so should probably be rejected. Instead, we retain the lineation indicated by the Masoretic verse division and accentuation, where Ata Yadcha is read as the beginning of verse 3. Not only does this have the support of the Hebrew reading tradition, but it also seems to be supported by the Septuagint. The Old Greek translation takes Yadcha, hechersu, as the subject of the following main verb, exolethrusen, destroyed, in verse 3a, clearly demonstrating that this word was read as part of verse 3 with the MT. The Septuagint lacks an equivalent for ata, which could reflect either a textual problem or the creative attempt of the translator to make sense of this difficult passage. The translator could have read ata as an awkward explicit subject for pa'alta in verse 2 and so omitted it. But the translator may otherwise have read it as left dislocated, as for you, and omitted it when transforming the first sentence of verse 3 into a third-person construction to smooth out the syntax. Furthermore, the reading Ata Yadcha with verse 3 is explicable in terms of word order, with the fronting of the subject and adverbial for topic and focus respectively. This is also closely parallel to the construction in verse 5, where Ata is similarly clause initial. While the lines are admittedly somewhat unbalanced and awkward, the strength of the reading tradition and the word order requirements compel us to read Ata Yadcha with verse 3, along with most modern versions, including the ESV. O God, we have heard with our ears, our fathers have told us what deeds you performed in their days, in the days of old. You with your own hand drove out the nations, but them you planted. You afflicted the peoples, but them you set free. If asked to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale of A to D, A being the highest and D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation a B rating. The second issue in Psalm 44 is the text and meaning of verse 5. The MT reads, Atahu malki Elohim, tzaveh Yeshuot Yaakov, with the word tzaveh read as an imperative. The JPS 1985 version renders this verse, You are my king, O God, decree victories for Jacob. The Septuagint, by contrast, reads, Sue autos abasilusmu kaitheosmu ho entelomenos tasoterias Yaakov. You are my very king and my God, he who commands acts of deliverance for Jacob. The main difference between the two is how to read the words Elohim tzaveh. The Septuagint rendering presupposes a different Hebrew-based text that read Elohai tzaveh, with the mem on the beginning of the second word read as a participle rather than the end of the first word. Since final and non-final mem were not clearly or consistently distinguished in early Hebrew scripts, these two could easily have been confused, and the difference is merely one of word division. Several translations follow the MT Elohim tzaveh, which has the imperative form of tzaveh, command, and suggests a vocative rendering for Elohim. It is found throughout the medieval Hebrew manuscript tradition. It's attested as early as the 2nd century AD in the translation of Symmachus. Sue basilusmu ho theos, entelai perite soterias Yaakov. You are my king, God, command concerning the salvation of Jacob. The Psalms Targum and Jerome's translation from the Hebrew also read tzaveh as an imperative. The main problem with this reading is it is a very poor fit in the context. There is a strong preponderance of indicative verbs throughout verses 2 to 23, which makes an imperative reading of verse 5 seem out of place. Looking more closely at the immediate context, verses 2 to 9 recount in consistently positive terms how the Lord characteristically delivers his people, which again problematizes the imperative here that does not seem to fit this pattern. The Septuagint reading, Elohai tzaveh with a participle, however, fits the immediate context perfectly, recounting the Lord's characteristic granting of victories to Jacob. This is also the oldest documented reading for this verse, since the Septuagint translation of the Psalms is probably from the 2nd century BC. Even though it's not found in any of the surviving medieval Hebrew manuscripts, it clearly remained a popular reading in Hebrew manuscripts at least up until the 2nd century AD, since it's attested in the Peshitta and, apparently, also Aquila's and Theodosian's versions. Though their renderings of the latter part of the verse have not survived, both Aquila and Theodosian are reported to have read, My God, with the Septuagint and against the MT. Aquila reads, Sui autos basilusmu theemu, You are he, my king, O my God. Theodosian reads, Sui autos basilusmu kaiotheosmu, You are he, my king and my God. Because this reading fits more easily in the context, some may be tempted to argue that it is a secondary smoothing out of the more difficult MT text and so prefer the MT. The preference for the more difficult reading cannot be applied rigidly, however, since scribal copying errors frequently create difficult readings. In this case, it seems like the difficulty in the MT is caused by a scribal error, and so we prefer the reading Elohai tzaveh. At some point in the early transmission of the text, a scribe wrote the two words very closely together, and an ancestor of the surviving medieval manuscripts misdivided the words. An alternative explanation is proposed in Barthélemy's Critique textuelle de l'Ancien Testament. The authors propose amending the text to Elohim tzaveh, where both words have a mem. They claim support for this reading in the Bodmer Papyrus, Ralph's 2110, which reads the verse without the second mu found in the other Greek witnesses, namely, Sue autos basilusmu, kaiatheos ho entelomenos tasoterias Yaakov. While 2110 often preserves good Old Greek readings, in this case it is suspect. The omission of mu is not only stylistically preferable in Greek, but also corresponds to the Hebrew text according to the MT, which suggests that it's secondary within the Greek tradition and may have been assimilated to the contemporary Hebrew text. In contrast, if the 2110 version were original to the Old Greek translation, it would be very difficult to explain why all the other Greek manuscripts added the pronoun against both good Greek style and the Hebrew text. So 2110 does not provide good support for the proposed Hebrew reading Elohim tzaveh. In CTAT, the authors suggest that Elohim tzaveh was original. One of the mems was omitted by haplography, and then different scribes decided to locate the single remaining mem in different places. But this added layer of complexity seems both unnecessary and unhelpful. There's no ancient support for the preserved reading, nor are there any good semantic reasons why this reading should be necessary. Furthermore, the explanation requires two separate scribal errors, haplography and word misdivision, instead of one. Since this emendation causes more problems than it solves, we do not adopt it here. Since the reading Elohai Mitzaveh is the oldest documented reading, was a common Hebrew reading in antiquity, and best fits the context, we prefer this reading with the Septuagint and other versions. So, for example, the CSB reads, "You are my king, my God, who ordains victories for Jacob." The MT reading resulted from a scribal error misdividing the words, which created semantic problems. The significance of this reading can be seen in its impact on the poetic flow of Psalm 44. One of the major features of this psalm is the sense of irony that occurs between covenant expectation and present reality. There is a sense of surprise that occurs when Israel's defeat and humiliation are revealed, beginning in verse 10. The imperative tzaveh in verse 5 would disrupt this sense of surprise by implying distress before the ironic twist. The participle mitzaveh, on the other hand, maintains the indicative mood of the immediate context and continues the extolling of God's character. This preserves a sense of surprise in verse 10, in which it is revealed that, contrary to covenantal expectations, Israel is experiencing rejection from God. We would rate our confidence in this reading as a B. The third issue in Psalm 44 is the identity of the speaker in verses 5, 7, and 16. Psalm 44 is typically categorized as a community lament, as first-person plural grammatical forms predominate. However, scattered throughout the psalm are a number of first-person singular constructions, verses 5, 7, and 16. The referent of these first-person singular forms, and thus the identity of the speaker of the psalm, is unclear. On the one hand, several commentators argue that the speaker is a liturgical or military leader. On the other hand, the alternation in grammatical number could simply be a matter of variation in literary style, with the collective community remaining the speaker throughout. Those who identify the singular I of the psalm as a political or military leader, most likely the king, point to the pervasive theme of military victory and defeat in the psalm. Verses 9 to 10 in particular make it clear that the presenting problem of the psalm is national military defeat. The king would be the most natural individual speaker, lamenting such a defeat and calling on the Lord to rise up and give his people victory. The relationship between the I and we of the psalm would then suppose a degree of corporate solidarity, where the I leads the congregation of which he is also a member and representative. This corresponds to similar shifts from singular to plural elsewhere in the Psalms that suggest a corporate unity between the singular speaker and the corporate community. On this interpretation, the alternation between singular and plural first-person forms could indicate antiphonal recitation, where the king and the congregation alternate speaking. There is, however, no repeated refrain in Psalm 44, which is generally considered indicative of such a pattern in other psalms. An alternative approach is to take the collective community as the speaker throughout the psalm. In this case, the alternation between singular and plural forms would not be due to different reference, but rather rhetorical effect. For instance, the intermittent shifts to first-person singular forms could have an intensifying or personalizing effect. Goldingay argues that the use of the singular on behalf of the whole community individualizes their commitment. Each individual within the corporate we self-consciously expresses the stated confidence and lament as representative of their own personal experiences, which are also shared communally. In support of such a rhetorical effect, scholars cite a similar situation in Deuteronomy, where the community is alternatively addressed in the second person singular and plural. The referent remains the same throughout, despite the shift in number. According to some interpreters, personal commands tend to occur in the singular, while general reports usually occur in the plural. An even closer parallel can be seen in Numbers 20:19. Vayomru elav b'nei Yisrael, v'mesila na'aleh, v'immemecha nishteh, ani u'meknai, v'natati michram, rak ein devar v'ragalai e'avora. And the people of Israel said to him, "We will go up by the highway, and if we drink of your water, I and my livestock, then I will pay for it. Let me only pass through on foot, nothing more," according to the ESV. Here, the plural children of Israel speak in the first person plural at first, but then shift to the first person singular when distinguishing themselves from the cattle who will also be passing through the land and drinking the water. The rest of the verse uses first person singular forms to self-identify the children of Israel, as is proposed for Psalm 44. In the numbers example, the first person plural and singular reference are not co-referential, since it seems like the cattle are also included in the initial we, but it does at least illustrate the use of first person singular forms for the community. While a plausible case can be made that the alternation between singular and plural forms is rhetorical rather than differentiating speakers, the parallels are not particularly close or compelling. On the other hand, the alternation between speakers is well attested in the Psalms. A third option is to identify the speaker as a priestly or Levitical liturgical leader. This approach easily explains the alternation between first-person singular and plural forms. It also makes good sense of the attribution of the psalm to the sons of Korah in its superscription. If these Levitical singers were the authors, rather than, say, David, then it would stand to reason that the psalm was written to be performed by a priestly or Levitical liturgical leader instead of a king. This may be explicitly indicated by the superscription indicating the psalm is lamnatseach for the music director to perform, which would strongly suggest a priestly or Levitical leader. The militaristic language need not be problematic for this view, since priests and Levites were regularly involved in the highly ritualized context of ancient warfare. The community both engages in warfare and collectively suffers from defeats, and the priests and Levites would be natural leaders in corporate responses in the context of corporate worship. No king is necessary. A good example of this is in Ezra 9, 6-15, where the priest Ezra prays on behalf of the post-exilic community, referencing Israel's kings and military defeat while shifting from first-person singular to plural references. According to Ezra 9:6, "O my God, I am too ashamed and embarrassed to lift my face to you, my God, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has mounted up to the heavens," according to the NRSV. Given the attribution to the sons of Korah, the representative role of priestly or Levitical liturgical leaders, and the close parallel attested in Ezra 9, we prefer to read the I in Psalm 44 as a priestly or Levitical liturgical leader who would lead the congregation in corporate worship. The singular constructions of Psalm 44 verses 5, 7, and 16 are best understood as references to an individual speaker who is leading the congregation as a fellow member and representative. While the military language might be taken to imply a king as referent, this language is just as easily understood in the mouth of a priestly or Levitical director leading the people in response to national tragedy. The alternative explanation that the community is both the I and the we does not seem particularly compelling or well supported by close parallels. The difference between singular and plural forms is more easily explained by supposing different referents who are in solidarity with one another. Nevertheless, the intermittent shift to first-person singular forms may still have an intensifying and personalizing rhetorical effect that could affect the analysis of the prominence in the discourse. We would rate our confidence in this reading as a B. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. We read Ata Yadcha with verse 3, indicating that his hand is the instrument the Lord used to dispossess Israel's enemies and plant his people in the land. Though admittedly awkward and somewhat unbalanced, it contrasts nicely to the statements in verse 4 that Israel did not possess the land by the strength of their own arm. In verse 5, we read Elohai Mitzaveh with the Septuagint and other ancient versions against the MT, Elohim Tzaveh. This best fits the context of a series of indicative statements consistently indicating the expected covenant blessings and promises, which makes the contradiction of those expectations in verse 10 and following even more striking. In verses 5, 7, and 16, we identify the first-person singular speaker as a priestly or Levitical liturgical leader who speaks both for himself and on behalf of the congregation as a fellow member and representative. This suggests a liturgical context of corporate lament for the psalm. This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 44, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. Our overview video provides a coherent interpretation of the psalm and explores the beauty of the psalm as a poem. All these videos are offered free of charge thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at Scriptura.org to learn more.